Meanwhile, as Donald Trump continues to hint at another presidential run, contributor for The Atlantic, Jonathan Rauch, is taking a look at what a second Trump term might look like. Jonathan joins us now, and let's read from some of your argument where you outline how MAGA Trump supporters could derail democracy by emulating the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. And I'll quote, first, install toadies in key positions. Second, intimidate the career bureaucracy. Third, co-opt the armed forces. Fourth, bring law enforcement to heel. Even more intimidating to the president's opponents than a complacent military is his securing full control at long last over the Justice Department. Fifth, weaponize the pardon. In Trump's first term, officials stood up to many of his illegal and unethical demands because they feared legal jeopardy. The president has a fix for that, too. Sixth, the final blow, defy court orders. And so, after 4 years, America has crossed Freedom House's line from free to partly free. The president's powers are determined by what he can get away with. He is term limited, but the MAGA movement has entrenched itself, and Trump has demonstrated in the United States what Orban proved in Hungary. The public will accept authoritarianism, provided it is of the creeping variety. We should not be afraid to go against the spirit of the age and build an illiberal political and state system, Orban declared in 2014. Trump and his followers openly plan to emulate Orban. We can't say we weren't warned. And Jonathan, when I was reading through the first through sixth, some of them have echoes of his first presidency.
Oh, all of them do except the last.
Right.
The first 5 of those, including weaponizing pardons and bringing the Justice Department to heel, and all the rest are things that he either did do or attempted to do in his first term. So it's not like any of this is obscure or unknown.
You know, Jonathan, there were some guardrails in place in the first administration. Thank goodness there were some experienced hands, both in the military and working around, thinking of General Kelly as his chief of staff and others, who tried at least to push back somewhat and prevent some of Donald Trump's worst instincts. The great fear, as you point out in your piece, is that all of those people will be gone, and it will be absolutely the freak show and the former hosts of obscure television shows and people who've defended him publicly, sketchy lawyers, who will be installed in high positions, and those guardrails, such that they were in the last administration of his, would be gone completely.
Well, that's exactly right. And we need to remember that toward the end of his term, especially after the election, he set about putting in place political toadies in the Defense Department and especially the Justice Department. And he could have succeeded in that, given more time. He was derailed by resignation threats, and the clock ran out. But that tells us very clearly what he would do right at the beginning of his second term, which is find political operatives and put them in places like national security apparatus and DOJ.
Yeah. So Jonathan, it's interesting. You talk about toadies in the Justice Department. A great column by Neil Katyal asking what in the world we do with the position of Attorney General moving forward after we look at what Barr did surrounding the Mueller report. You know, we'd always, of course, prosecutions, investigations have to move forward in the executive branch. But with Barr, you had somebody who worked overtime to whitewash the worst parts of the Mueller report, characterized it in the wrong way, and they just put out a final report where Barr steps in and decides on his own that Donald Trump didn't commit any crimes. It just isn't what happened. Mueller, in fact, said in his investigation that he wasn't cleared of charges. He just couldn't charge him. I'm curious, what do we do about an issue like that? What have we learned from Barr's mishandling of the Attorney General's office?
Remember, Barr was a very respectable former Attorney General, and although he did indeed, I think, plausibly protect Trump from the Mueller investigation, In the rest of DOJ conduct, he mostly played by the book. In a second term, what's likely to happen is Trump would not repeat the mistake of appointing an attorney general who would go by the book. He'd just appoint someone like the pillow guy. Then the Senate, either because it's in Democratic hands or because this is a step too far even for the Republicans, might not confirm that person, and Trump would say, OK, I'll just make them acting attorney general. He did that in his first term, too. He's got all kinds of ways to do this. It is, if you've got a president who's got 4 years and is determined to weaponize the Justice Department, I don't think we can stop that.
So, Jonathan, you note here in the piece that, of course, were Trump to be elected again, he would never have to face voters again, and therefore would not be answerable to them or really anyone else. And you float the nightmare scenario that he would defy court orders, that he would just simply ignore the legislature if, say, Congress was in the hands of the Democrats, and would be banking on the Supreme Court to back him up. Now, we well know he has appointed 3 of the sitting justices. What, in your estimation, is the likelihood that the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Roberts, still atop it, would go along with some of this in this scenario that you have dreamed up?
I think they'd go along with not very much of it. Trump, as we're now seeing in the Mar-a-Lago documents case, is perfectly capable of functioning entirely outside the law. I think he'd have a hard time corrupting the courts, but at the end of the day, he'd be in a position to simply defy court orders. That's the bridge he did not cross in his first term, but I think he would in his second. I think his behavior right now shows that he's pretty clearly defiant. And once he's done that, we're no longer a Republican democracy. The rule of law is finished. The courts do not have their own police. They do not have their own law enforcement. If a president simply defies them, as Andrew Jackson did, very famously, there's not that much we can do.
Wow. Contributing writer for The Atlantic, Jonathan Rauch, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning about your piece.